There we
Good to see
go.
you, by the way, John.
All right. Hello and welcome to another edition of the Dr. Joseph Warren Historical Society interviews with prominent authors and historians talking about smallpox epidemics during colonial times. My name is Randy Flood, and today I'm joined by my colleague, Christian DeSpigna, author of Founding Martyr, The Life and Death of Dr. Joseph Warren, the American Revolution's Lost Hero. Our guest today is J.L. Bell, author of The Road to Concord, How 4 Stolen Cannon Ignited the Revolutionary War. Now, J.L. maintains the Boston1775.net website dedicated to history and analysis about the beginnings of the American Revolution in New England. His other historical writings include General George Washington's home and headquarters at Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is a comprehensive study for the National Park Service. And also, he's made contributions to Todd Anderlich's Reporting the Revolutionary War and James Martin's Children in Colonial America. So, J.L., welcome to the program. And Christian, why don't you ask JL our first question?
I wanted to start by just adding on to the blog that, John, you've been doing it for over, what, 10 years now, 12 years, 15 years?
Over 10, actually. Now that time has stopped, I think I missed the anniversary, but it's now 14 years.
Well, and I got to say, and, you know, I try not to dole out praise, but I think you're doing it better than anyone. I don't think there's any person better than you if someone has a question about colonial New England to go to. So I really want to make sure people know to subscribe to the blog and also to buy the book, because we want to have you back on another episode to discuss the book. But right now we're just delving into the smallpox epidemics in 18th century Boston, 1764. And I thought, who better to ask than you about some of the indirect consequences these smallpox epidemics had on the town of Boston?
Okay. Well, it's very good to talk with you both. And so what are the questions?
Okay.
So the one thing I wanted to ask was, we all know about, well, most people watching this know about the direct consequences that smallpox had on the town of Boston during that 1764 smallpox outbreak. But what about some of the indirect consequences that smallpox outbreak had on the town of Boston in 1764 and 65?
Well, Boston at the time was undergoing a difficult period. In 1760, there was a great fire. That came during the French and Indian War, so there wasn't a lot of support from the imperial government, and people were worried about that. On the other hand, when you're a port city in a war, you actually do get a lot of economic activity. It was probably worse for Boston when the war ended, and there was this post-war recession starting in 1762, 1763. Then came the smallpox. People were aware of smallpox, of course. They knew what to do, they were used to it, and yet it was always, of course, very scary, very deadly, so that was a hit in itself. During that smallpox, one of the things that they did was the Massachusetts General Court, the legislature, which usually met in what was called the Townhouse, which is now the Old State House Museum in downtown Boston. Well, that was too close quarters. That was too close to the smallpox outbreak. So they moved out to Harvard University in Cambridge and were using a space there, Harvard Hall. One of the indirect consequences, as you know, is that one night the Massachusetts Council went home. They must have left a fire burning in the meeting room where they were, and the Harvard Hall burned down, and it had to be rebuilt. And so the current Harvard Hall dates from 1764, 1765. It is the rebuilt building. It was actually designed by Francis Bernard, the royal governor of the time, who became a very hated man within the next 6 years, but he still has this monument to his architectural ability in the Harvard Yard. Another possible consequence of this event, and it certainly fed into the problems that Boston was facing, in April 1764, one of the people who died from the smallpox was the wife of Nathaniel Wheelwright, a merchant. She was also the sister of another merchant named Charles Apthorpe. And Wheelwright and Apthorpe had this business partnership. During the war, they had the business of shipping in hard currency, specie, gold and silver, to pay for all the soldiers in North America. This was a very lucrative business because you got to basically charge 4% on top or whatever it was. And it meant that they were two of the people in North America who always had hard money. So people were investing with them, basically loaning them money and then using their IOUs as currency for their own debts. Because the idea was, okay, you could always count on Mr. Wheelwright's IOU because he always had money. Well, the death of this woman from smallpox in April 1764 may have accelerated the breakup of the partnership between Wheelwright, the woman's now widower, and her brother. And by the end of the year, Apthorpe, who had already been moving to New York to settle there, had formally broken up and was trying to divide the property of the partnership. And it turned out Nathaniel Wheelwright didn't have enough money to pay off all his debts to Charles Apthorpe. And he went bankrupt suddenly. And that meant all those people who were using IOUs from Nathaniel Wheelwright as their own currency, suddenly those IOUs were bankrupt, were worthless, and they went bankrupt. Among the people caught up in this wave of bankruptcies was Dr. Joseph Warren's mother. And that just shows how far into society it reached, that this widow living out in Roxbury was caught up in this fiscal crisis, which first broke on Boston's Change, the street where merchants would talk and meet. So it was as if Wall Street had come all the way to Main Street and was hurting a ordinary farming widow. That all happened in late 1764, early 1765. And then the Stamp Act arrived, news of the Stamp Act. Now, the Stamp Act had been in the works in Parliament for a couple of years before. At one point, the Prime Minister, George Grenville, asked the American colonies, okay, we won't institute the Stamp Act now. If you give us a plan for how to raise revenue that you think is fair, we will use that instead. And of course, the American colonists didn't want to raise revenue. They didn't want to pay more taxes, so they didn't come up with a plan. And only then was the Stamp Act instituted. So it wasn't a great surprise to see it, but nevertheless, the American colonists were very upset about it. There were formal protests starting in Virginia, but it was in Boston in August 1765 that the first informal, out of doors, on the street, symbolically violent protests began, and those became the model for all the other Stamp Act protests going down and up the Atlantic coast and even onto the Caribbean islands. So in a way, all these things are tied together because of this overall feeling of danger, of loss, of living on the edge, and we cannot, Bostonians were thinking, suffer one more disaster. We cannot spare any of our cash, and now the Prime Minister wants to put in a Stamp Act. So that is how all these things, the smallpox epidemic, the fire, the recession, and Mr. Wheelwright's bankruptcy sort of fed into, I think, a more heightened worry that led to the political unrest.
You know, it's just amazing that there's so many parallels to 1764, 65 to 2019, 2020. And I mean, not exactly, but you're talking about an epidemic, you're talking about economic depression, you're talking about protests, riots. I mean, it really is incredible when people say history repeats itself. I mean, it does in many forms, but I just find this fascinating.
Yeah, it's the sort of thing, when you study revolution and war, you don't really want it to be relevant to current events,
Right.
at least in your society. And yet, right, you look around and look at what we have to do because of the disease, what we are facing with the question of what government should be. It's very relevant.
Yes.
Relevant. Well, John, we know one of your special interests is the study of children during the colonial period. Can you give us a feel for what inoculation might have been like through the eyes of a child during the 1764 smallpox scourge?
Sure. One of the very first documents that I sat down to look at when I started to research the period was a diary by a little boy named Peter Thatcher, who was about 10 years old in 1764 when he underwent inoculation for the smallpox. And he kept a diary of the experience. He grew up to become a minister, and therefore he kept everything, including this childhood diary. And one of the things at the time that was most interesting to me was seeing how he learned how to keep the diary. At first, all he didn't even have dates in it, and everything was all mushed together. And then gradually you see him figuring that out. But you also see him undergoing the treatment, which started with being actually infected with a cut in the arm and some pus or scabs from somebody who had already had a mild case of smallpox put into your system in order to stimulate your for you to get smallpox, but then to stimulate your immune system to fight against it. He was also being treated with various pills and potions and powders, which were supposed to help. I don't know if they had any helpful effect at all, but they certainly did have an effect, because his diary is full of things like took a powder, worked me 5 times up and once down, worked me twice overnight. These were, I think, him either throwing up or having to go to the bathroom. This was part of the treatment. An element, when we think about medicines, we're also often worried about side effects. You see those ads on TV and they say, some possible side effects include nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, vertigo, and so on and so on. We don't want that. Back then, one analysis I've read says that people actually looked for drugs with side effects because that's how you knew they were having any effect at all. So he was taking what we would consider to be very disruptive, horrible drugs, which were thought to be the very best medicines of the time. So he was being worked up and down, off on his own. His parents were elsewhere, and he would he was receiving letters from his sister and writing about people around him who were dying, because there were people dying of the smallpox. This is where I just noticed that Mrs. Wheelwright, he mentioned her death. There were it was 2 or 3 weeks. He had the treatment. He survived. He recovered. And then he went home. But then later in that year, his mother died. There were other experiences that I've come across of young people dealing with smallpox. There's a story from 12 years later, or 11 years later, when the siege of Boston was taking place, and the Quincy family, Josiah Quincy's wife and son, the man or the little boy who would eventually grow up to become Mayor Josiah Quincy of Boston, Quincy Market. That little boy was allowed with his mother to leave the town of Boston, but there was concern then too about smallpox, and so as they left, they had to stop on the Neck, which was the narrow space between Boston, the narrow spit of land between Boston and the rest of Massachusetts. They had to stop, and he had to get out of the carriage, and he wrote about this later, and go into what he thought of as a guard box, a sort of sentry box, a small wooden structure about the size of a sentry box or an outhouse, and walk around a shelf built around the 3 sides. And in the center was a little fire full of sulfurous chemicals that was burning, making smoke. And this was how the idea was that by walking around inside, you were in there long enough that your clothes got all smoky, your hair got all smoky, and that was supposed to kill the smallpox. I have no idea whether that worked. I don't know. Smoking wasn't very important, and clothes had to be smoked, and other property had to be smoked before it was allowed out. Yeah. So that's the sort of experience. Just thinking, he was only, I think, about 4 years old at the time. Thinking about what supposedly the very best treatment was for the smallpox in the 1770s.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about some of this with the smoking and some of the other consequences. one of the things that's interested me is that, you know, we know that in the 1721 outbreak that inoculation was not really widely accepted until certain people saw that it was having a positive effect. But even by the 1760s, 1770s, smallpox inoculation was not wholly embraced. And we see this in 1774, the riots in Marblehead. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, I think that people understood that inoculation worked. The problem was if you didn't do it right, you were literally spreading the disease. And so they wanted very much to make sure, well, there were some people like even Benjamin Franklin who just did not want to take the risk. And he later wrote that one of his greatest regrets as a young father in the 1730s was not having his son inoculated, and the son died of smallpox. Another man who it always surprises me was not inoculated was General John Thomas of the Continental Army, who died of smallpox in 1776 after being very helpful, influential in the siege of Boston, being sent up to Canada to help there, and then dying. And he was he was a physician, he was a doctor, and yet he had never been inoculated. So there was still indeed some suspicion, but I think that was mostly people realizing, okay, there is a certain risk in inoculation. I'm just not going to try it myself or with my family. The other societal problem was if you have an inoculation hospital, that means you know that there are a whole lot of people who are sick with a contagious disease there, and you want to make sure that the clothes aren't taken out, that no property leaves, that people are very carefully checked to make sure that they have fully recovered before they leave. And that was what was seems to have been the problem in Marblehead, when some of the elite families of the town, many of whom were involved in the revolutionary movement, they sponsored this inoculation hospital, and yet there were the townspeople became worried about clothing or other things getting loose. The smallpox was loose in the North Shore at the time, up in Essex County. One of the Massachusetts Superior Court judges died of smallpox that fall. So there was reason to worry, and yet it may not have been connected with that hospital. Who knows? But in any case, eventually the people of Marblehead, some people got so upset, so worried about this hospital that they went and they burned it in the middle of the night. And this was, as I say, an enterprise that was actually sponsored by people who were patriot resistors at the time. So it shows that even if you were politically on the popular side, you could still be seen as too elite, not caring about the common people by having your expensive inoculation hospital and yet not doing it right.
Interesting, interesting. Well, John, we know that early in the War for Independence, this epidemic was really front and center on the minds of the respective leaders. What action did George Washington take during the siege to mitigate this devastation of smallpox?
During the siege of Boston, he was very worried, especially towards the end of 1775 when enlistments ran out, and then in early 1776 when it was still working hard to get them back up, when he basically did not think he had enough soldiers. He was worried that the smallpox would come and devastate his army. Mm-hmm. He was worried, and it's clear from his letters that he actually believed that the British authorities, the royal authorities in Boston, were sending people out, poor people who had the smallpox or who had smallpox infested the clothing, or at least they were being reckless about it. And he was worried that those people would spread the disease in his army. He knew from having had smallpox as a teenager himself, through the natural way, that about lifelong immunity. He knew that that was the way to make sure that you were safe, but he felt that he could not spare at that time any of the soldiers in the army to do that. He could not have a widespread inoculation program. So he was had very strict rules for any soldier who showed any of the symptoms of the smallpox to be sent to a special hospital away from others. He had all these concerns in his letters about refugees from Boston coming out with the smallpox, and yet he was not yet comfortable with the idea of a widespread inoculation. That would only come later in the war when he felt it was safe to have hundreds of men taken out of action for a month in order to be inoculated and to recover.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's amazing how, I don't know even if we sometimes realize what a part smallpox played in all of this, in the lead up to the revolution, in the Revolutionary War, and really how many millions, hundreds of millions of people it killed over thousands of years. So, I mean, I think it's particularly relevant to the pre-revolutionary era and the revolutionary era. So,
yes, I mean, there's a whole book, Elizabeth Fenn, Pax Americana, about this smallpox epidemic. And one thing that I find especially striking about that book is that it shows that the smallpox virus had no respect for national boundaries. We think of the Revolutionary War as this fight between the American colonies and Britain and France, and the smallpox was sweeping across North America and hitting the native nations. It was hitting Spain down in Mexico, and it was all clearly the same epidemic crossing all these boundaries. So yes, smallpox was much more of a killer in that period than it is now, of course, but even than war itself, probably.
yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, John and Christian, that's all the time we have for this session. So, JL, Christian and I hope you'll join us again for another session in the not too distant future. And we look forward to commentary when we on the road to Concord.
Yeah, we definitely, we need to get to this book.
That's right. I love it. I think it's a terrific book, and we look forward to your commentary on our next session. Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much, Randy.
Thank you so much. Yep.
Thanks, John.
Take care. Okay, we're done.
We're done. I just went ahead and clicked it.
Yeah.
So hang on a second.